Good evening, and welcome to the 7th program of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's 2022 8-week Great Decisions Series, with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association. I'm Ingrid Nelson, principal of the Ingrid Nelson Group at Berkshire Hathaway Home Services, and a member of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan Board of Directors. On behalf of the staff and the entire board of the council, I thank you for your attendance, both here in person and online. We are pleased to host the Great Decisions Series on Grand Rapids Community College's campus, and we are grateful to GRCC President Bill Pink, Provost Brian Nettle, video producer Klaas Quant, and campus colleagues for their support and expertise. It is the Council's mission to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do this through the support of nearly 50 local businesses, 11 colleges and universities, and many community members. Together, we seek to provide programming that is credible, objective, relevant, civil, and connecting. To change the world, we believe, one must first know the world. And you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. Before we begin, we say thank you to Wolverine Worldwide as a series sponsor, to Blue Lake Public Radio and the Community Media Center as media sponsors, and to Calvin University as tonight's topic sponsor. Tonight, we are honored to host Vonda Brunsting, a senior advisor at the Institute for Responsible Investment at Harvard University. Thank you, Vonda, for taking the time in this unprecedented global moment to be with us here in West Michigan. After Ms. Brunsting's presentation, there will be ample time for questions. For those of you here in the auditorium, we'll have a microphone to pass. For those watching on the Council YouTube channel, you may type your question into the chat box and it will be forwarded here. As a reminder, please exhibit civility to our guest and hospitality to the others in the audience by asking respectful and succinct questions. And now, Dr. Noah Tolley, Provost of Calvin University, will introduce our presenter.
Thank you, Ingrid. And before I get started, I would be remiss if I did not take just a moment to knock down that little clicker. To bring you greetings from your sister organization, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, where I serve as non-resident senior fellow for global cities and have since 2016. And I appreciate deeply the investments that everybody here makes in having these kinds of conversations in West Michigan, and especially the work of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. I appreciate this partnership and opportunity to sponsor an alumna of Calvin University especially. And I bring you and her greetings from the university, and we're glad to see her speaking on such an important topic. Vonda Brunsting is the program manager for the Just Transition Project at Harvard's Institute for Responsible Investment. Before joining the Institute for Responsible Investment, she was the director of the Capital Stewardship Program at Service Employees International Union. Prior to her time there, Vonda worked as a community organizer in Chicago, New York, and Boston with the Industrial Areas Foundation. In addition, she co-founded the Trustee Leadership Forum for the Retirement Security here at, or rather, there at, the Institute for Responsible Investment. As mentioned, Ms. Brunsting is a Calvin alum and holds an A.M. degree in public policy from the University of Chicago. Her presentation tonight is titled Creating a Just Transition in Climate Change Policy. Before we welcome her, let me retrieve that clicker so that she doesn't have to.
Thank you.
And now join me in welcoming Vonda Brunsting to the front.
So I have to start by correcting my bio because when I went to Calvin, it was Calvin College. And it's Calvin College in my mind, but it's now Calvin University. So I'll have to change that. So thank you so much for having me. I am delighted to be back in West Michigan. I not only went to Calvin College, but I grew up here. I grew up in Jenison and in Hudsonville. And when I woke up this morning, I looked out and I thought, oh, I'm home. The cloud cover was about 20 feet off the ground. It was very cloudy. But now we have a great spring day. So hopefully I can claim some credit for bringing some sunshine to West Michigan. I don't know. You can tell me later. But I want to start by asking a question. And that is, have you ever had a smell memory? People know what that is? Have you ever been somewhere and you have a smell? I have to stay here. And it reminds you of a place or of an experience. Well, I have a smell memory sometimes when I am in the grocery store and I'm in the produce section and there's something about the celery and the onions and the water spritzer that brings me back to the muck fields. I grew up with lots of memories in Hudsonville, known as the Salad Bowl City of those muck fields, worked for a time in them, as did a lot of people that I knew, and remember vividly a spring day when, before the crops went in, the wind came up and the muck was everywhere. We had to close the windows and there was still a little bit of dirt on every surface in the house. So those muck fields in Hudsonville and Zeeland were wetlands that were drained by the enterprising Dutch farmers that came, including these. I was delighted to find this picture. I don't think many of them are left, the celery farmers, maybe one or two farms. I think they were, with the advent of the corporate, big agribusiness and so forth, and the growth in California of agriculture, a lot of the celery was sourced there and not in West Michigan. And also, I think the soil was depleted after so many years of farming. There was a study actually that I found on Michigan State, a PhD student who had looked at the amount of phosphates in the soil. But that muck farm really, for me, it brings me back here, and it brings me back to my connection to the land. And the connection I have to the land, for me, is a doorway into the work that I have done the last 4 or so years on the just transition. So that doorway is hopefully a place for you to join with me tonight for the next hour or so to explore what the just transition means. I will define it. This is the agenda. So if you think I'm really going off, just wave your arms, because I have a tendency to do that. But I want to talk a little bit about climate, the moment we're in, as well as define the just transition, and then go through sort of a way that the just transition can happen through centering citizens, workers, communities, and the land. And then hopefully I'll have time to get to what it means for West Michigan. But for me, the just transition is something that happens in place. And we're in West Michigan. And so I've done a lot of work over the last number of years looking at the just transition globally. But then to me, the story comes back to the places and the communities which are going through a response to the world's changing climate. So just a little bit on climate, which I'm not going to go into too much because I'm not an expert. But there are a group of experts that you can read about. And this is the front cover of a recent report that was done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is their 6th assessment that's come out in sort of a series over the last 6 months or so. And they've been around since 1988, I think. They were formed as part of the United Nations Environmental Program. And it's an effort to inform policymakers around the world on the impacts of climate and allow them to sort of benefit from the scientific research and then make and take appropriate action. So 195 countries participate as members. And in this report, it was done by one of the working groups. The sixth assessment was included 234 scientists from 66 countries who analyzed 14,000 peer-reviewed studies. So they did all of that so we don't have to. I probably couldn't even, I referred to that study on the phosphates. I didn't even read that whole paper. But I have all these scientists who have gathered all this information for me so I can understand what's happening. And you can find them all online, but I'm just going to give you sort of the summary from the current report. And you'll hear this term IPCC thrown around a lot too, but they basically, in sum, say that in order for us to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, we need a system-wide change. So we're no longer talking about a little here, a little there. This is across our entire economic system. And that means changing how we manage our land, consume goods and services, store our waste, travel, and even how we eat. So that's a big agenda for us as citizens in whatever we do, as well as for the business community, investors, students, all of us who are really on this planet and needing to pay intense attention to what's happening. Just another resource that I wanted to offer to you, and that is some work by Catherine Hayhoe, and I can share all this so you can have it afterwards in my PowerPoint. But she's a client scientist and also the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a professor at Texas Tech. She's also the climate ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance. So she did a TED Talk that was titled, "The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change." Talk about it. So I feel like, okay, we're doing that here tonight. That's something that we're all capable of doing, talking about it. And then her recent book is called Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. So if we're gonna talk about it, and for me, that means talking about the just transition. What is the just transition? So this is a lot of words. You don't really have to pay any attention to that. You can if you want to. But really, in essence, the just transition is a process to move our economy from being extractive to regenerative. And so what that means, and that was something that was put together, that there's more work that's been done by a group called Climate Justice Alliance. But the history really is to go back to the 1990s when a chemical plant was closed in New Jersey, and the workers all lost their jobs because the plant was closed. And they said, well, we need a transition to something else, and it should be just. And so that was the first time this concept of a just transition was picked up. It was picked up by workers in many places. And then it was also picked up by the Pope Francis in an encyclical. That's the sort of third set of definitions I offered up there. He wrote an encyclical in 2015 or 2016 called Laudato Si, on care for our common home. And really, again, picking up the theme that it's both the human environment and the natural environment that are going to deteriorate together, so we cannot adequately combat one without the other. So that, the work that came out in that encyclical, also a very good read, along with the work that workers had done. The ITUC definition is here, an economic-wide process and transformation, then went into the preamble to the Paris Accord, which states the imperative of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with defined development priorities needs to be included as we work towards a low-carbon economy. So that's the just transition. I like to think of it as a process. And if you think of the word transition, it's pretty, who doesn't want to have a transition between a job, a move, change in your family, if it happens abruptly to you, it's terrifying. I think about a lot of the catastrophes that are happening due to climate change, due to war, and of course Ukraine is all on our minds. Folks who have no notice about needing to flee for their lives, or in reaction to a fire or a tornado, right? Those kinds of transitions, well, you couldn't even call them a transition. What we're looking for is a process and an opportunity to plan for the workers and communities that are going to be most impacted by climate change. So that's the way that we look at it. And then you'll see a bunch of, what do you call those at the bottom of the screen there? The logos, that's why I couldn't think of the word logo, from all the different organizations that have helped and worked with me as we started to think about the just transition from a very particular perspective, and that is of investors. So there are governments who are picking up the just transition. The Scottish government has a just transition commission. The Canadians, around the world you'll find these. Obviously workers are thinking about it as they're looking at job loss or job change. And communities, of course, are thinking about this because what if the only job in town is at the coal-fired plant and it's set to close? What are we going to do? But what's the role of investors? So that's the particular niche that my colleagues and I have tackled. And I don't want to talk too much about it, but I did want to offer it up because that's how I have come to the topic of the just transition. So just to give you a sense of how much people are paying attention to this. And actually the number there, I have to update it. But we put out a statement to look to investors to say that they supported an effort to look at the just transition. And a lot of them signed up. And these are institutional investors. So it's now 161 investors with 10 trillion in assets under management, which is even harder to kind of wrap your mind around. But all this is to say that folks are concerned, they're trying to figure this out. What does it mean for their investments? And the investors that I work with tend to be pension funds who are holding the retirement savings for workers, or big asset management firms. HSBC is one of the ones who signed on to this, or Hermes, Boston Common, but also endowment funds who are holding the assets for ministers and retirees from religious endowments, including the United Reformed Church Ministers Pension Fund signed on to this. So there's a broad appeal to figuring it out and to trying to work through the issues that it raises together. So leaving the investors, and you can, again, I'm happy to share all this if you don't have time to read all these words. I want to talk about how the just transition can center residents and workers and communities and the land, and then get to, hopefully, time for us to talk a little bit about how it relates to West Michigan. So these two pictures are of two communities. The one on the right is in Staten Island, and it's called Oakwood Beach. The one on the left is in New Orleans. And so just the quick story here, there was a book written by Elizabeth Rush called Rising, which looks at the loss of the wetlands in the United States. And she looked at a number of places around the country, including Staten Island, which I, of course, gravitated to because I often ride my bike around New York City and have been to this place, Oakwood Beach. But the way it looks now, and I should have probably put up a before and after picture, is all you see are wetlands and grassy fields. Because what happened is, this is a picture after Hurricane Sandy, and the homes were flooded, as they always were. I mean, this is a low-lying area, reclaimed wetlands, and after Hurricane Sandy and the loss of life and home, the residents started to knock on each other's doors and say, are you gonna rebuild? How much money are you getting? Where's FEMA? All these different questions people were asking. How do we rebuild our lives? And they found a provision that would allow them to go to the state government and be paid the fair market value for their homes if they relocate. Of course, this saves the government from having to rebuild the roads, the sewers, the entire infrastructure of this community had been disrupted. And so they did that. They all collectively, there might have been one or two holdouts, sold their houses. a lot of them moved to different parts of Staten Island. Some moved to Florida. Other people went elsewhere. And within, they came and they pretty much leveled that neighborhood. And within a couple of years, the wetlands were back. It's stunning. The other story, in contrast really to this one, is after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And this is a picture of the Lower Ninth Ward, where the homes that had been flooded out were marked with an X on their doorframe to say that it's uninhabitable. And then 4 or 5 months later, the city actually went through and started to bulldoze those homes without prior notification. The residents, of course, were all gone because they were uninhabitable homes. And there was no consent, there was no discussion. It's just that your house is gone. And so the headline here, Bulldozing the Dead in New Orleans, is quite literal. That people who had died there had not been able to be reclaimed by their families from their homes. Tragic story. And for me, just points to the importance of people having agency and the ability to make decisions about their own homes in a limited way, right? I mean, obviously, people are going to make decisions that may go against what's common sense, but at least giving folks the opportunity to work together to come to some solutions seems to me a better way to do a just transition. And then another approach is to think about how to center workers in a just transition. And this is a picture in Quebec. In Quebec, the province, probably 30 years ago, started a savings fund where workers could put their retirement savings. That money then would be invested in the province. So the workers were able to save money for retirement and help the small businesses in their communities and get a return so that when they retired, they had those savings and the investments return to help them and help them have a secure retirement. So this fund, it's called the Solidarity Fund. The French name is there. I confess I don't read French or speak it, but someone can tell me what that says later. But what they did is, on the just transition is a number of years ago, the Solidarity Fund went out to all of the small businesses, organizations that were invested in the fund, they had put their investments, and they asked the workers and the administrators and executives, what do you think we should do about the just transition here? What would it look like for you and your workplace? And as a result of that listening process all over the province, they invested money in these businesses that wanted to do retrofits and other transition work that would help their businesses succeed as, again, we move to a low-carbon economy and make sure that those workers were cared for, and they were part of the process. So again, being part of the process, I think, is important to all of us. The next example I want to talk about is Colorado. Colorado, like parts of Michigan, has a boom and bust economy. You know, I remember going to Colorado and visiting ghost towns. I don't know if anyone else has done that. But mining was it's part of the cultural fabric. It's a mining state. And there was an announcement, I don't know when they made the announcement, a couple of years ago, they were going to close 8 coal-fired plants and 6 coal mines by 2030. Wow, that's pretty dramatic. This map shows you the picture of, you can't really see it. You can see the blue dots and the red dots are where the coal-fired plants are and where the coal mines are. So it's pretty much all of them except for maybe one coal mine. And so they decided in 2019, the Colorado Assembly, the legislature, to have an Office of the Just Transition under the governor, and they would come up with a Just Transition Action Plan by going and talking to people in these communities and helping figure out what would happen to the workers in the communities and really the economic development that's needed, because in some parts of Colorado, this is also part of their tax base. If there's a coal-fired plant or another business that is contributing to a third or half of your tax base, when they pull out, what happens to, who's going to fund your schools, the roads, the sewage treatment, the things that we need for, our daily lives. And so that process I'll talk a little bit more about, hopefully, and move along. So just the last piece here is, as we work towards a just transition, how do we center the land? And the quote here is from Robin Wall Kimmerer, she wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which I highly recommend. And she talks about how it's not just the land that's broken, but more importantly, our relationship to the land. And so the boom and bust economies mean extractive and depletion from the land, right? And the people. So it's not just the soil that's being robbed of its nutrients or the mines that are being extracted from. These economies, our economic system, too often sees people and land as expendable. And so she talks about this in Braiding Sweetgrass and has this lovely quote, which I thought talks about the balance that is needed and where we should fall on the side of, and that is on the side of creation. And then the other picture that I put up here is from a permaculture program that is at Michigan State University, and the Michigan State University Extension Program, this is in Flint, Michigan, of an edible garden where people are trying to think about different ways of farming and land management. That's called permaculture, but it's much more regenerative. It's not about just sort of, you plant, you pull it out, you do the same thing the next year. It's how do we have a symbiotic relationship between plants and the way that we care for our gardens or our fields or our farm life in a way that feeds each other and does not just extract. So that's, I think, also a inspiring movement among the folks who are thinking about land and farming and how we grow and how we feed ourselves, right? I also wanted to talk really quickly about something that I'm so taken with, which is a concept in Judaism called the Shemitah year, which is this year. So in the Jewish calendar, every 7 years, you have a year where you release the land, you release people from debts. It just seems to me like such a smart thing to do. And this is a quote that I'll share with you from Exodus 23, which talks about 6 years shall you sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th you shall let it rest and lie fallow. And the same concept is talked about in Deuteronomy to forgive debts in the 7th year. So what if we had a different relationship to land, to people, to each other, one that didn't extract and had provided more nutrients for all of us? So then let me really briefly turn to West Michigan, since that's where we are. So West Michigan, I am coming back after many years. While I've come back for family events and so forth, I haven't been a student of West Michigan for a long time. So here's where I'm going to rely on all of you. But I wanted to chat a bit about how we could take some of the lessons from other places and maybe apply them to what's happening here. And I'll try to go through this really briefly so I have time to answer questions and perhaps you can share with me some of your stories. So the 3 things that I came up with for ways to take action are just sort of symbolic. I'm sure there's lots of others. But one is a pretty interesting project in Sunset Park in Brooklyn on community solar. So again, maybe there's something here. You guys can tell me about it. But this is, it's not in this, okay. I had a picture of the Navy Yard in Brooklyn, which is a huge industrial park on the waterfront, where they're going to equip the entire industrial complex, the top of the buildings, with solar. And so it won't be individual solar, but it will be solar for the community residents and for the business community. So for me, making the leap from individual, you have solar panels on your house, to a more collective, what does it look like for renters? If you don't own the house, you can't put solar panels on your house. If you're a small business, maybe you can't afford to do it. But here's an effort in Sunset Park to do community solar, where it's a partnership between the power company, a cooperative power company in New York, and a community organization called Uprose. So that is about to start as one example of things that we can do. The second one is this. I already talked about the just transition in Colorado. So this is a picture of one of the community sessions that they held, which I think looks like, to me, it's in a school cafeteria. So great things happen in school cafeterias and church basements. I think that's probably where the real work of communities takes place. So I mentioned the closing of the plants and the mines. And so this obviously is going to impact people's jobs, but also their property taxes, the local economy, and also their community identity. If you're, there's a sense of pride for me in being from Hudsonville, for other people being from Grand Rapids. It used to be the furniture city, right? So these are things that are part of our identity, and coal mining and mining in Colorado is part of their identity. How did they make those shifts? So they talked it through together, and they established an office to help the state and the business community, investors, workers, and the community residents kind of figure this out together. So that's inspiring. And then one other example, and that's for the universities who are here or listening. I, as it was mentioned, work at the Harvard Initiative for Responsible Investment. It's housed at the Harvard Kennedy School in the Center for Public Leadership. We have this lovely room on top of the building that it's called the Malkin Penthouse, and it has a bunch of chairs. It kind of looks like that church basement there, except for it has more windows. So right before the pandemic, in the December of 2019, we invited workers, environmental justice organizations, folks from academia, investors, and utility companies to come and gather together for a dialogue. And it was publicly traded utility companies, because the investors were there because they were very interested in what the utilities were planning on a just transition. At the time, they weren't planning anything, because most of them weren't that familiar with the term or had many plans. But today, the Securities and Exchange Commission released new rules for disclosure on climate. So I think companies are starting to figure out that they have to do it. And so you don't have to go it alone, right? We had 8 utilities in the room, companies. And then the day before, what we did is, back to the church basement, we went and met across campus at a congregation that opened up their halls to us so that the investors could meet with the workers, because the workers didn't feel comfortable, didn't feel like they could be completely honest in the room with their employer. And so we created a space for them to share their stories, which then the next day, the investors could take in and talk with the companies about. It was a really powerful dialogue, partly because we had people who don't usually talk to each other at the table. So I say all this as an example of what universities can do, because just like tonight, universities are great places to be conveners. And I think this setup is maybe not the right setup with the rows in kind of a classroom format, but I bet you there's a room here that has round tables, and that would be perfect for it. And then I just, I like silos, I guess. I thought this was a great picture, but it was really, I put it up here to say that while the grain needs to be in these silos, we don't need to be siloed in our relationships. And it's important for us to work through the just transition by breaking down some of those silos. So I think that's the work that we have to do. And it's, it can be very daunting and overwhelming. So I'm just going to leave you with a couple of quotes, and then I'll ask Erica to work with us on some questions, hopefully. So last year, one of the heroes of the civil rights movement died. His name was Bob Moses. Robert Moses is what he went by later in life. And very inspiring person who went around and registered voters in Mississippi with at the threat of his life many times. He then went and started something called the Algebra Project, which taught young people math in schools in Boston. And he was quoted by saying, "You have to break off a little chunk of a problem and work on it, and try to see where it leads and concentrate on it." So I like that. Climate change is overwhelming. If you look at the IPCC report, you have to brace yourself for the bad news, I suppose. And there's a lot of bad news around us. But if we can just take one chunk of the work and work on it together, it feels like we can all do something. I also was really inspired by the climate negotiations last year in Glasgow. There were lots of talks and so forth. I wasn't there, but I did read news reports about it, including one which had a picture of students and young people marching on the streets in Scotland with banners that said, nothing about us without us, which I really loved. And it turns out it's a very old political slogan. It was picked up by the disability rights movement in the 1990s and now adapted to our time. So I think that really speaks to how I think about the just transition. Let's not do this by not including the people who are most impacted. So nothing about us without us. So with that, I will turn it to questions, and I'll leave you with a quote here, because I think that when, going back to the doorway that I used at the beginning of my presentation, I think doorways lead to questions, to inquiry. My brain is exploding by being back in West Michigan. It's just such a delight. And they can be very provocative and stick with us. And so you might be asking me the question, but I would also have you ask it to yourself and to ask each other. And it may be that I can't answer the question, so I might turn it back over to all of you. So thank you.
All right, let's start by giving Vonda a round of applause. And it looks like we've already got some hands in the air, but just as a reminder, if you are in the audience, you can raise your hand. You can also text me at 616-308-6560. And if you're watching online, you can type your questions into the YouTube chat box and they'll get to me. So just to get us started, and then I'll take some questions in the room. But Vonda, are there countries around the world that are getting just transitions right? And who can we look for to find some inspiration?
Okay, I just wanted to leave it on this picture because I like it so much. Yes, I think that Scotland is a good place to look if you wanted to go deep. They have, as I referenced before, a commission that was set up by the government to provide a framework for both at a policy level, right? There has to be a way for policymakers to lead on the just transition so that there's a level playing field for all the companies and businesses and communities. And the transition, if you just think about the utilities and energy in and of itself, is huge, much less all the other enterprises that flow from that, as well as all the, the infrastructure and the common good, the public goods that people are reliant on. The utility company in Scotland, SSE, has gone through its own just transition process, again, similarly using different frameworks to bring in workers and communities and develop a set of goals and then a set of processes. So I think that's one country. Interestingly, I think in Canada they had a Just Transition Commission because Alberta and British Columbia are very dependent, very energy heavy industries, and those provinces are going to go through tremendous changes. They didn't do, I think when the commission went out to talk to people, workers were sort of surprised because no one had ever talked to them before. So I think they're sort of at more beginning steps. They've also done a lot of work in Canada to bring in the Indigenous communities and to really employ a concept that's called free, prior, and informed consent. So I think a really great set of processes, if they're followed well, which the folks in New Orleans would have benefited from, if they had had free, prior, and informed consent before someone bulldozed their house. So this really goes to the siting of energy on native lands and as well as what the impacts are on water and so forth. So I think there are places that are, trying to get at this. And then regionally, I talked about Colorado, but certainly you could look at almost every country and find pockets of folks who are working on the just transition and glean different things out of it. There's been some really interesting things. Well, I could go on, but I'll stop there. Come and talk to me afterwards if you want me to point you in other places.
Two questions for you. One having to do with employees. Chipotle is testing robots now to make chips, and big box stores expect us to do our own checkouts.
Uh-huh.
Is this just for workers? My second question has to do with environmental justice.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about a low-carbon society. How do we get there without a global embracement of nuclear energy?
Well, so on the first question about the workers, again, I think that the process is important. So I don't know the specifics around Chipotle. I didn't know that. Certainly, we've all experienced the checkout. I think that there's a certain amount of change that's happening, that's underway, that it's, it may be inevitable, it may not be, but I think that the most important thing is that people are brought into the process. So if in fact that's going to displace workers at Chipotle, are they being brought into that discussion? Are they given the option to retrain? Are they being given the option to work in another part of the company? Are they being skilled up so that they could take on a job in another industry or something comparable? I think those are the questions that I would want to know about, given the changes that are happening, the technology changes, which are happening quite rapidly, right? There is a lot of displacement. We did a lot of work on McDonald's too. Again, the inevitability perhaps of the touch screens and the electronic approach. But the jobs really, there's a lot of service jobs in our economy now more than ever, and they have to be decent jobs. So how is it that people can work and make a living, right, in our service economy and, feed their family, send their kids to college, own a house? I think that takes sort of a reckoning about how we treat work, which is probably a whole other topic, which I'm happy to talk about again later or at another time. In terms of your second question in nuclear, I don't have much of an opinion on it. I probably should. I think different countries are responding in different ways. I know in some cases the nuclear power plants are being closed. There's actually a really good example of a just transition process at Diablo Canyon in California, where there was a nuclear plant that's about, I think it's probably almost offline. Again, just to, say it, the process about how that happened, I think is important, and it was done in a way that brought in the community that was impacted and the workers at the plant. Can we get there without it? I think that the innovation that's taking place around fuel sourcing and energy is pretty dramatic. There's some examples of just new technologies that I've been reading about. So I don't know. I guess that's the answer. Maybe somebody else wants to respond to the question. But I think that there has to be some pretty transformative shifts. Can we do it without nuclear? I don't know.
Okay, I hope I heard this correctly, but did I hear you say in the introduction, or someone saying in the introduction, that you were involved with the Industrial Area Foundation?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, and I know that there is a big movement. They're trying to get that started in Grand Rapids with a lot of grassroots involving churches, synagogues, things like that. So there's people trying to do this in our own backyard right now. Mm-hmm. So could you talk a little bit about the experience you've had with that, some of the successes you've seen, and how it would work with responsible investments? And just go for whatever you have a good story for.
Okay, so let me think. Chicago or, well, I guess the first place that I worked for the Industrial Areas Foundation was in Chicago. And the concept, and you'll see my career path here, because I haven't really fallen that far from my original training, was to get people together in church basements. And in Chicago, I was a member of First Presbyterian of Chicago, which was on the south side when I was at the University of Chicago. It was a few blocks south in Woodlawn. And it was one of the founding organizations for the Woodlawn Organization, which was an organization that Saul Alinsky formed probably in the 50s or 60s. I don't know exactly when. And I eventually went to work for the modern, I guess, fast forward a few decades, on the other side of Chicago in Uptown, for people that know it, which is a fascinating neighborhood because it's sort of like the first place people go when they come to Chicago from all over the world. So I think that there were 60 languages spoken, and there were different community associations set up by the Cambodian community, the Vietnamese community, the West African community, the Native American community. So it was this very vibrant mix of folks, and we actually got together working with the young people from these associations who, it turns out, had no place to go after school. And there were actually Park District properties buildings, like community centers, but they were closed because, I don't remember, it was too long ago. They were either closed because they didn't have the funding to have people in those buildings or for some other reason. And so we fought collectively, engaged, had lots of discussions about how to open up those buildings for the young people after school. And we did it with the young people. And so one memorable meeting, we went to the park commissioner's office, and they're always taking meetings from community folks. They expected 2 of us. 50 people tried to crowd into the office and lay out our vision for what the young people needed in the local parks. And I think that's one of the issues, but if I'm right, it's not just the parks and other concerns, it's really all those issues that impact communities that are being taken up, but the process by which those issues are determined are driven by the community and the folks who are involved. So they might decide that they want to work on housing, they might decide that they want to work on schools. In terms of the investment side, unrelated, but maybe not unrelated, I now do a lot of work with a group called the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. So this is an organization that is comprised of a lot of religious endowment funds. So the Dominican Sisters or the Presbyterians or the Quakers might have a pool of money that's for their retirement for their ministers or their rabbis, or it might be a building is sold off and they put it into an endowment to manage. And so this group has really been a long-standing ICCR, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, doing engagement with companies around issues. Well, now it's around climate change. But 50 years ago when they started, it was around apartheid. And they go and file shareholder resolutions at companies. They talk to companies, Exxon, over and over and over again, trying to push them to change. And they use their shares as a tool to sort of make sure that they're being heard. So if they walk into a company's headquarters, they might get shooed out. But if they're a shareholder, they actually have a vote and a voice. And so they use that collective power to try to make change at companies. And it turns out that Saul Alinsky used that same strategy probably 50 or 60 years ago, before anyone else did, at Kodak in Rochester, New York, when they were organizing. So I guess the different threads of my life are in some way woven together. Sorry, long-winded answer, but
No.
Yeah.
It's great to have some examples and how this kind of gets mapped out. We do have a question from one of our viewers at Western Michigan, and she is asking, what can you tell us about regulations that might require firms to report on their climate impacts so that pension funds, et cetera, can invest responsibly, and will they be reliable metrics?
That's a great question. All right, so first I would look at the guidance that came out from the SEC today on climate reporting. So companies have long had to report on climate risk, but generally. Now it's actually mandated, it will be measured, and it has to be tied to metrics that will then be overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So it has more teeth to it. Will it be enough, done in the right way? These are all questions that I can't answer, but I am quite sure that without scrutiny, support, folks looking at those reports, it won't happen the right way in all cases. I mean, some companies are going to do the right thing because it's part of their culture. For other companies, it might be really hard, or they don't think they have the money or the resources, or for whatever reason, they're just going to kind of like check the box and do the bare minimum. And so I think that there's going to have to be a lot of engagement with companies. So I think the nuns and the ministers and the folks who are part of ICCR, they're not going to be able to hang out, close their door anytime soon. I think that need for that kind of constant engagement is going to be important. I also think that, there's a lot of companies that want to do the right thing, and they also need to talk to their peers, and they also need to have support from their investors. So I think there's a lot of room for the kind of bodies that will sort of support that and the messages that come from both the investor community as well as the workforce, as well as from the business community that are sort of supporting this effort, right? If you're an investor relations professional at a company and no one's ever talking about climate change, then why would you, you're not going to respond to it. Again, going back to the Catherine Hayward, who was talking about like the need on climate change to talk about this. I feel like we can do that in whatever place we happen to be. So if we're in a business, we can talk about it. If we're a student, we can talk about it. If we're an investor, we can talk about it.
Hi.
Hello.
Is it on? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it sounds as if you're sort of painting a very rosy picture of corporations for me. Because in my experience, there are a lot of corporations that don't want to do the right thing, or they're driven by profit.
Yep.
And I'm thinking about a couple of examples here in West Michigan when we tried very hard to get Meijer to stop using plastic bags.
Mm-hmm.
And, bottom line is plastic bags are cheaper for them, and they won't switch. They won't get rid of them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of another example with Electrolux in Greenville, who there was a huge community movement to try to get them to stay. But in the end, it was cheaper for them to move to Mexico and use cheap labor.
Mm-hmm.
So how can responsible investment really be impactful in the cases where corporations are just driven by profit?
Well, I didn't mean to paint a rosy picture because that has not been my experience over the last 3 decades. It's very frustrating work and tiring, I think. I think that I think there has to be a way for us to think about a different business model, frankly. That one that doesn't sort of just see shareholder price or as much profit as possible as their sole reason for being, right? How do you bring in other factors? And I think what's helping it, which again, based on the number of investors who are supportive of a just transition, the work that's happening across the world, there is this sort of push. So companies are going to have to either choose to be leaders or laggards. Sounds like Meijer's has chosen the latter. But that's their choice. They shouldn't be making that choice in a vacuum. They should be hearing from customers and consumers. And so if there are groups that are formed to do that, they're taking note. You can't give up. I mean, that's the thing. That's why I quoted Bob Moses, because if we try to tackle it all at once, it's just way too overwhelming. We each have to sort of take our piece and push it, right? And keep on it and do it with other people so you don't feel alone. And then bring in the folks who have power. In some cases, it might be a university that has the power. That's why all the students are trying to get universities to divest from fossil fuels, because, it's closest to them, and they feel pressure from their students, and that's a good thing. I think that there's a whole range of activities, in addition to a divestment, that people should be working towards with companies, but they have to get out of the mindset of being in a silo. Like, profit is really my only reason for being. If you are the last business standing, that's not going to be very satisfying. We're all interconnected, as Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about, right? And so that, maybe we need to educate folks. And maybe, these kind of forums are the places that we have to be. I definitely feel like, we have to be in it for the long haul. I feel both a mixture of incredible impatience, because the reports from the IPCC are dire, right? And you can see it happening around you, right? I mean, it's not as if any of us hasn't felt it. I was visiting my sister in Colorado and had to get in my car and get down the mountain fast because there was a fire, and you have that experience and it feels like, oh my gosh, there is no time. And I'm advocating for time to have a transition. So there's a bit of a contradiction, I think, in what I'm saying. I get that. I'm not quite sure how to manage it, but that's where we're at.
Thank you for your presentation. Okay, thank you for the presentation. I actually had 2 questions, but Professor Pauly asked the first one, because as she mentioned, corporations are not very willing to change their processes, and it really comes down into minimizing costs and maximizing profits. But as you mentioned, all the Glasgow, all the COP26 and 25 conferences, all the gasoline use and all the CO2 emissions, just for a bunch of people to sit down, talk, and then leave, take a bunch of pictures, of course. And so I was thinking of how can we fast track this, because we do have a deadline on how fast we are deteriorating the environment. But my second question is, when we're talking about just transition, how can it be just to poorer communities who cannot afford to switch to not fast fashion or fast food? That could be very costly for these communities. So how could we ensure that it's just for them too?
Yeah, I think that's part of what's talked about in Laudato Si, the care for our common home. The Pope talks about it's really the folks who are most vulnerable that need to be prioritized first. And I think you then need, with a just transition, to think about how that goes in terms of countries, right? So what are the countries that are most vulnerable? What are the parts of what are the countries that are at sea level, the island states, and places that are ill-prepared or ill-equipped to make the transition. And so they're part of the agreement, and the negotiations are around getting the developed countries to put money into helping the transition take place in places like India and China and South Africa. And there was a commitment made to fund, I can't remember how much, in the billions of dollars. It might have been $5 billion in South Africa. And what's great about that is that there's actually a whole process set up that is enshrined in the government to have, and I can't remember the term for it, a process that brings together for decision-making the impacted folks and workers, communities, and so forth. And so that came out of apartheid. After it was dismantled, the new government set up this way for there to be, in decision-making, a process that included the impacted people. So I feel like that's in South Africa, they've got pretty much one huge utility. There's mining. There's a lot of work to be done. I mean, it's pretty daunting, and maybe a little down payment that was paid or committed to in Glasgow. But that's the kind of stuff that has to happen, right? Is that countries who have the means to need to support those who don't, and then that has to happen at a global scale, and then also at a very micro scale. And so that's why you see a lot of organizations working in the US to transition, like in Richmond, California, where Chevron has a big plant. The community has been, borne the worst of, pollution in their backyards, their water system, their sewage system. The job situation is very dire, education. And so in their own backyard, there's a whole effort by the community to probably fight first. They're in the middle of that, but eventually get to a place where they can work with Chevron to make the changes in Richmond that they need. And it's happening at a legislative level, but very much so at a community level. And I think importantly, there's been a practice that I think companies and governments have done where inadvertently or maybe intentionally, communities are pitted against each other, and that has to change, right? So that folks on one side of town aren't pitted against folks from another side of town, but that there's actually a process to bring people together to work towards a shared agenda and then bring it to the company. And that happens in the workplace with different unions. It happens in religious organizations with different, right? It's like we're set up to fight each other. How do we get over that? So there's a cultural shift that has to happen that would allow us to come together, have more power, to then have more, be able to negotiate more effectively with the folks who are really, I think, making a lot of decisions that are against our common interest.
Got a couple questions. Got a couple questions from the virtual audience. First is just if you could repeat the titles of the books and authors that you mentioned, The Rising and Sweetgrass, if you could.
Oh, sure. So Rising is by Elizabeth Rush, and that's the title, Rising. The other book was Robin Wall Kimmerer, and it's Braiding Sweetgrass. And if I mentioned others, I'm happy to share them with you, Erica, and you can send them out to folks.
Absolutely. The other thing, and I think this is something that we talked about before you visited, the political will at the federal level in the U.S. To embrace a just transition strategy. I mean, it just doesn't seem to be there when we look at policy. Would you agree with that? If that's the case, then are there other ways in which we collectively in the U.S. could be working towards those goals?
I think that, I think it has to be worked at every level of government. So I think the school board, the town, the county, the region, the state, I mean, every place that people come together to make decisions about how people live and thrive in a society, it has to happen. At the federal level, with the infrastructure bill, there's more money that's going to especially coal-impacted communities. So I think there's going to be a lot for us to learn from different regions that are kind of on the front lines, I think, of climate change in terms of how it's going to, at least in the, the chain that has to happen. I mean, arguably, it has to happen all at the same time, but coal first, right? So I don't know about the state of Michigan, where things are at here in terms of a legislative or governmental response to what's happening. Certainly, the Great Lakes are a vulnerable place, and we could talk for a long time about water. I mean, I grew up being able to go to Lake Michigan, and I think I'm not alone in, I don't come back as frequently as I used to, but I always go to the beach and see those houses that are slowly tipping in. But there's an impact on people's lives that I think demands a governmental response at all levels. So I wouldn't, I couldn't make an assessment about the current administration. I think no one is doing enough fast enough. That's my sort of.
This is related. As we say the government isn't doing enough. Maybe let's dog on the media. We see pre-selection of media by adherents of different and arguably opposite political persuasions, misinformation and disinformation promoted by particular sources of information for many. Do you have ideas concerning how broadcast news sources and social media that are inclined to disinform but have been shown to captivate their listeners and viewers can be convinced to promote a just transition?
Yes. Wow. So I am a huge believer in asking questions. And I think I don't know when I started asking questions. I think probably I was a child and criticized for it. I don't remember. But I think asking questions has been the one thing that I can always come back to. And so I think getting all of your news from one source, I fall in the same habit myself. You just kind of click on the app that has the news feed and, right, just being mindful of where you're getting your information from, listening to people who have a different opinion than you do, trying to understand why they think that way and not just sort of like shut down or write them off. Again, and then having places where we can have this conversation, right, which is, I think, really important. Maybe you don't want to have it at your Thanksgiving dinner table. Maybe you don't want to have it on a street corner, but are there ways for us to facilitate communities coming together to have this discussion? I think there's a loss of institutions in our society that used to be places where people gathered, and that's harmful to the fabric of our society. And so whatever you do to be, I would just say get involved, anything, right? Like if you are concerned about the state of our democracy, then get involved, because we are, democracy is a verb in my mind. It's not a noun. It's something that we do together. And if we don't participate, then we're part of the problem.
I wonder hold on just just a sec.
If you don't ask me questions, I'm going to start asking people for their smell memories, which might be very dangerous. I don't know.
Thanks. This goes back to the comments about the involvement of investors in your meetings, and particularly perhaps being interface between workers and companies at times. Some of the investors, well, an observation would be that more and more of the total invested dollars are out of the stock market and into businesses through private equity. And so those businesses, for the most part, are not going to be subject to the SEC disclosure guidance that was just released.
Yet.
Right. Yeah, I think that's correct. But those businesses are also often backed by individuals. So question is whether or not investors from that part of our economy were engaged. We'll also say those investors are often the ones who are reaping the largest financial rewards for their investments based upon the business model. And could be a place for, if you've got a beleaguered pension fund for a bunch of retired religious communities, that might be the best place to get your best return, right? So that's a challenge. But I'm wondering, how have you been involved in conversations with those kinds of investors about how they balance what's towards a just consideration versus core economic return? Yeah,
I think that's a really important question. So, we're all part of this financial system, whether we like it or not, right? And some people are in it as an individual investor. Some people have a retirement fund. Some are just putting their money at a bank. I mean, there's certainly lots of people who are outside of it and should be in it, but we could debate that further. But I think that for your question about private equity, some of the same holds true, at least for the institutional investors, right? So they have focused a lot of effort, following on the model of Saul Alinsky and the Industrial Areas Foundation, on publicly traded companies and filing shareholder resolutions. But the private equity has really bought up so much. It's a little harder to find out, but it turns out that with the help of Google and other search engines, you can find out more about a company than you used to. And so I have done a lot of work with community groups trying to help them understand who's behind that apartment building that's going up, or that storefront or whatever else it is, that nursing home, right? Where you can put the name in and you can certainly find out some of its investors. And so then those investors need to be engaged with. And so I'll just give you a quick story. I don't know if people noticed, Toys R Us went bankrupt a couple of years ago. So a number of the workers that had worked there for 10 and 20 and 30 years, I mean, Toys R Us was their family. You could say, oh, probably didn't pay that well, but they were making it. They were going in every day and giving their all to this company that just announced like that they were going bankrupt. And the workers were sort of taken aback. And a couple of them, going back to the questions, started to dig and ask questions and say, wait, how is this? Why are they bankrupt? Because it turns out in my store, I work the cash register. Business has been really busy. I don't understand why they're going bankrupt. Turns out that they were bought by private equity, a consortium of a number of private equity firms that was invested. Those private equity firms had clients that were pension funds. These enterprising workers figured this out and banded together and then went to some of those pension funds and said, you need to help us. And they were able to, with the investors' support and in alignment, go and demand a settlement for some of the wages that were lost, just for like a temporary measure, but they got nothing when the original announcement meant that they were left with nothing. So there's efforts that have happened, but it's very hard, and it takes a lot of work. And private equity, you're right, it's very much shrouded. People are intentionally not out in the public markets, and you have little information. Even if you're an investor, you have little information. But I think that with the way that young people are really good at figuring things out online, and with folks who can't stop asking questions, there's ways around it, and then some of the same tools and strategies can be developed on those companies. But there's certainly, if you look at our residential market, probably more people are living in residential houses that are owned by private equity than anything else. Our nursing homes have been bought by private equity firms. So this is something that I think we as citizens need to be very concerned about, and then help the investors understand that maybe they need to think about something more than just the return for their pension, and help them start to ask more questions of the investment manager, because they are often uninformed decision makers as well, right? So again, it's hard work. If you talk to those Toys R Us workers, it was their life for a year, right? Not an easy thing to do, but I think really necessary.
This is maybe a similar question. Are there companies that have been just transition champions, or maybe even proving that it pays to do the right thing?
Yeah, I think that the businesses that I talked about in Quebec, right, that are sort of looking at how to retrofit, how to make the changes that they need to. They're going to the fund to sort of support them with low-cost loans and other things. There's lots of businesses that are at a very local level trying to pick this up. And then there's big companies like Unilever and the SSE that I mentioned, but other utilities in the country that are trying to figure out, we're working with Excel, which is the big utility in Colorado. How do you do this in a way that doesn't just promote sort of a boom and bust or extractive approach to the changes that we need to see happen? So I think there's lots of companies that are doing the right thing. There's a Just Transition, I may not remember the name, but there's a business organization for companies that are working on the Just Transition, and my name isn't pulling it out. It'll come up in 5 minutes, and I'll have to get back to whoever asked that question, but there's lots of examples out there.
I think we do have time for just one more question. And I think, given the sense that throughout this conversation you've said this is hard work, Hadil has mentioned, oftentimes it's the most vulnerable in our community who are asked to do these things. So how can we support communities that are trying to make these transitions? I know you've already talked a little bit at the community level, but thinking about getting involved and really trying to make an impact in your local community, what can people do?
Well, I think you should be looking at what you eat, what you do with your waste, how you use your water, and then look at where you do business and ask those same questions. I mean, I was staying with a friend in California, and it was longtime friends of mine that I've been visiting for a long time, and they are in a drought area in California where some of the wells have gone dry in their town. And so they were showing me in the shower, there's a bucket. You turn the shower on, it takes a while to get hot, the bucket fills up, you take the bucket and you put it in the garden. And it was sort of like, he's like, it may not be doing anything for the drought in California, but I can tell you that every moment of that day I was thinking about water, because I had just spent 3 minutes carrying this really large bucket out to the garden and filling up the watering can and then putting out some of it into the plant. So I think some of it is we should start where we're at. And do things that kind of keep it front of mind, right? And you could say, oh, recycling, what's one more bottle? Do I really have to spend the extra money to get an electric vehicle? I can't afford it. Do I really have to take the bus instead of taking my car? I mean, there's lots of daily decisions that we make that may not amount to much in our own minds, but I think that collectively they add up, and it forces us to contend with, I think, that original definitions that I put up about the scale of the change that needs to take place and how comprehensive it needs to be. And what it needs to do is to change the way that we think about things, right? So that we need to have a different relationship with water instead of just like turning on the tap and taking it for granted. And, rather than just throwing, you don't see people just throwing garbage out the window of their cars that much anymore. Right? I think that we're capable of making these changes. When I was a kid, we never used seat belts. Now, if I don't put it on, well, first of all, the car tells me I should put it on. But there's something that feels weird about it, right? We all adapted to wearing masks. I was talking when I came in about putting a mask on and then remembering as a kid putting a bicycle helmet on because it felt weird not to have one on. So I think that if we can make these changes in our behavior, it brings it more to the center and the front of our lives, And then it's going to expand, and so we are then going to ask questions of the places that we shop, that we do business, that we invest, and that will then help us to sort of drive the change that we need to in ways that are large or maybe just small and tiny, but that's, it's all needed. Oh, okay. You're welcome.
Thank you, Vonda, for being with us tonight and for this intriguing conversation. Our next Great Decision program is 1 week from today, on Monday, March 28th at 6 p.m., when Elizabeth Shackelford from the State Department, former State Department diplomat and fellow at the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs will present on Biden's foreign policy agenda, how it started and where it is going. That will take place both in person here at GRCC and, of course, virtually. Again, thanks very much for being with us this evening, and to all of you for striving to be world aware.